they're a hot mess. Well, why didn't they get it? And if we did those CFAs like you're talking about, teachers would know exactly which kids fall in line, which kids will pass those summative assessments, which kids need remediation and immediate remediation before they actually, these misconceptions, especially like say with regrouping, with the misconceptions can ruin, late learning later on down the road. But I'm glad you talked about that. Okay, and it's true or false? Teachers generally do what he or she believes is best for students.
True, if they're following the data trail.
Okay.
And if they know those students.
Yeah. So, and it's the teacher who has to take that data for their students. And so you seem like you have some understanding on the steps that need to bring those students to that larger TEAC to be successful. You know that if they don't get this, they're not going to get this, so we have to go back. Yeah, I agree with you, Jen. Susan?
I totally agree. Yeah. Yeah, you have to always go back and look at those CFAs or that daily.
Yeah.
You just have to keep looking at all of that data. And,
over and over. Yeah,
I got to do what's best for the kids for sure. Yeah, that's, I mean, if I can't even think right now, I can't even think if a teacher didn't do that. I mean, oh my gosh, so.
I think some do, sadly,
Yeah.
But it's exhausting. And I'll tell you why. And at the last slide that I'm going to show in this presentation, it says why learning targets don't work. And I think because a lot of teachers think that what you guys are doing kind of naturally, where you're setting up smaller goals to reach a larger goal, a lot of teachers think that it might be a lot, oh my gosh, I have to change the learning target every day. Today's lesson is obviously very loose. It could be a today's lesson over 3 days. So it's not, but I know a lot of teachers like to go in, write their learning objectives, language objectives, and be done with it. I used to go in when I was a first and second year teacher. I would run in there, I would write my learning objectives and my language objectives quickly for compliance. I don't know if you've ever done that. I did. I'll do that. But then once I had this training, I did on Mondays, and I kind of trained my kids. At first it was hard to go through learning targets, and a lot of them lasted through the week. I don't have a picture of my classroom, sadly, of what I do, but I'll show you the template that I use. But from time to time, today's lesson only goes 3 days. So I need to change the learning target for today's lesson. And it's quick enough to do. As soon as you shift from, say, that 2-digit addition to 3-digit addition, you just change some wording and things like that. All right. So learning targets are not instructional objectives or language objectives. That's kind of traditionally what our compliance piece is for our district. But learning objectives or instructional objectives, they're very broad, and because they're so broad, they need to be broken down, and that's what the learning targets are. And so learning targets are the procedures that guide learning. So the step-by-step steps that the teachers determine by themselves or with a team, ideally, of what the kids need to be able to attain that broader goal. So if you see here, it says lesson size chunked information. So that would be your day-to-day planning. But most importantly, what's working, what's not working, but what are we asking our students to produce to show me that they understand that certain chunk that would be required for them to go on to the next step, and then the next step, and then attain the goal for that whole TEAC. And like I said, I generally do this on Monday mornings, and it takes probably about a half an hour to go through all my lessons, but I'm self-contained, so I'm doing all. And if I see that they're getting antsy, I kind of stop it. But when you do that and you involve students in the learning targets, the students will understand what they're doing. It's not a secret, like, can you do it or not? And they're like, and they don't even know what they're doing. So you let them know what they're going to be learning. And sometimes you're modeling and teaching it right during the learning target session. And at that time, I'll say, you're going to say it is that 2x2 addition with regrouping. I'm showing them an example and I'm saying, and this is the problem you're going to have to solve. And this is the, so they're like, oh, and if they follow, that, and then after that, you can build upon that. But the students are actively involved in knowing what they're doing. There's another discussion about why they even need to do it. How many times when we were growing up, we're like, when am I ever going to need this? They come up with some great ideas. Like, why would you even know how to do this? I'll share some with you that I've come upon with this. All right, so here we go. Ready? All right, so the most effective teaching and most meaningful student learning happens when teachers design the right learning target for today's lesson and use it along with their students to aim and assess for monitoring. All right, so what Susan and Jen, both of you had said was, when we watched that elevator clip, that students were not successful because they didn't have the background knowledge of how elevators worked, how to talk to each other, some discourse on to solve problems. They were waiting for the I don't want to say janitor, the technician to come and fix the elevator for them, and then sadly his stopped, and he was stuck there too. They all ended up sitting down, and so I'm going to read this TEK, and we're going to you can look at the TEK, and then because the background knowledge is or the steps to get to this broad TEK are needed. So right now we're going to talk about what steps that a student in third grade, because you're both third grade teachers, what a student in third grade would need to know before they would be able to be successful on a summative assessment. What does a teacher need to assess and determine that a student can do before expecting them to be successful on a summative assessment? So this is a math one. We're going to determine the solutions to word problems involving addition and subtraction of time intervals in minutes using pictorial models or tools such as 15-minute event plus a 30-minute event equals 45 minutes. To me, that sounds like a different language. Like a kid would be like, I haven't, like, what? So what, I have a thing in my classroom that says the language of math is spoken here, because sometimes math, and I chose math because some of the words, if they don't know the vocabulary, and I know that we have a lot of second language learners, if they don't know the vocabulary, the likelihood of them being successful in breaking this down and actually solving a problem. So what do you think some of the vocabulary words would be that a student would have to know in order to be successful at this TEK?
Well, we just did this recently. Yeah. So they're gonna have to know what the word elapsed means, because that's gonna come up in the story problems. For sure, they're gonna know about minute intervals, hour, time. Trying to think what else.
And you notice the word elapsed is not even in there. So elapsed is something that the teacher would have noticed in some of those word problems, like you said.
Yeah, so because it's going to come up for sure.
Jen?
Sorry, my son came in and started the microwave. I didn't want it to be making all kinds of noise in the background.
Things that happen with remote learning.
Yes. I'm sorry.
So what are some vocabulary words that you feel as though your students would need to know in this TEK? What would you have to do? Some background knowledge of some of the terms that are used in this TEK.
Time intervals, what a pictorial model is, like what a 15-minute event is, what a 30-minute event, you know, like those time events would have to be clarified what exactly it means.
I have another thing to add, like you're going to have to teach them their strategies. You know, you can do it on a number line. You can do it with a analog clock. I mean, I can't even think right now.
Yeah,
A circle clock. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, so you're going to have to teach them those strategies of how to do the time on those different platforms.
Okay, so that brings me into my next question. So the vocabulary would be elapsed, and I know that I usually make my students say elapsed past,
Right.
past, elapsed time past, like a million times. Yes, intervals, in between, pictorial model. You know, if they say, okay, you have to do a pictorial model, but they just want to, and it's grading their ability to do it in a pictorial model, but they might be able to just answer it. It's not going to be correct if they can't use it using pictorial models. And they would have to say, okay, what is a pictorial model? I got the answer, so we'd have to kind of dial that back, and that would have to be another thing. So what skills? So bringing that back to even time, what do you think the first skill would be that you would need to assess your students that they know how to do?
I would assess making sure they know time to the hour, half hour, quarter hour, and minute.
I agree.
5 minutes and minute, actually. That's what I know when we just did this TEK, we went back and we just did a little baseline. What did you remember from second grade? So,
Jen,
can they draw it?
Yeah, I agree. So because if we're asking them to do a task about how much time is passing from this time to this time in writing, if they can't identify it and you're telling them to use it through an analog clock, if they can't even get to the starting point, then they're definitely not going to be able to get to 15 minutes past or 30 minutes past or 15 minutes before. Perfect. All right. So this is just, I know that whenever I'm taught something or a new method, I'm like, okay, I love the idea about it. It sounds great. But just give me a form and let me see what you're doing. And then I can tweak it for myself and how it works for me and my students. So this is the learning target chart that I have used and it has worked for me. I've seen, and I like things to be, because things in the day can get so crazy. The important thing for me is I'm keeping on task. So if we said our first learning target, today's lesson, as soon as we see that TEK, I can tell time to the minute or tell time to the hour, check. So I can, why do I need to know this? Well, I need to be able to be able to tell elapsed time. So student evidence of learning would then be maybe a little exit ticket, 5 clocks, hour, half hour, because ideally, I guess when I read this again, they're really testing, and I can ask you guys, because you're really familiar with third grade TEKs, they're putting you at a 15-minute interval, right? When they're asking in the word problems, are they putting you it started at 3:15? Right. It started at 3:30. They're not saying it started at like 3:11, right?
No, it's usually 99% of the time on the 15, 30, 45. Yeah.
So even if your kids didn't know time to the minute, would it be sufficient to move forward if they knew